thinking that I ended this lesson at the Great Awakening, but apparently I didn't. So
I do that a lot.
we won't be done today. I thought we'd be done today and take the test, but we won't. I did put the Salem stuff up, so if you want the extra credit, and it's really short. It's only at 4 points, but it's up there. All right, so we were talking about, and I go blank, the intellectual movement called the Enlightenment. All I could think of was Renaissance, and I knew that wasn't right. So today we're going to talk about another movement, a little less intellectual, though not totally not intellectual, called the Great Awakening. And I'm sorry, this is how I have to do the slides. I forgot my thumb drive. But at least the information's there. The Great Awakening was a theological movement, so it's religion. And it is in part a reaction to the Enlightenment. But it might have happened on its own. There's some similarities between the two movements, but some very specific difference. Early in the 18th century, the world was awash in a sea of faith, particularly in the colonies. Hundreds of new congregations are going to be formed in the first half of the 1700s, between 1700 and 1750. 85% of Americans lived in colonies that had an established faith. So there was a church that colony, through taxes, supported. This movement, these churches had regulated local parishes, and in most instances, they didn't accept outsiders to preach without permission within their church. So you just couldn't come in and start a new church. Once a parish was established, it was the responsibility of the minister or pastor that was hired to take care of it. But this Great Awakening is going to change that. The movement brings in, as part of the movement, there were itinerant evangelists who caused turmoil. They claimed that the local parish ministers were incompetent. They urged people to be reborn. And they preached a very individualistic version of salvation. Your salvation was between you and God. Jonathan Edwards, I know I'm going to get ahead of myself. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. This was a very invigorating yet fragmenting movement. It's going to appeal to the masses, unlike the Enlightenment. And it's going to be the first popular movement that's going to span all of the colonies. Most, as we've talked, the colonies were separated. Virginia was Virginia, Massachusetts, Massachusetts. And never the two shall meet. Not that they didn't both recognize that there were British colonies, but at the same time, they were individual colonies. They didn't bond to each other, as fellow colonists. They were just Englishmen. The Great Awakening, like I said, is in part a reaction to the Enlightenment. It's also a reaction to that prosperity that we talked about, particularly in the New England colonies. As people are getting more money and a little more materialistic, those half-covenant individuals, they're the ones that these itinerant preachers are going to target. You also have the unchurched that live on the margins. So Scotch Irish that live in the backcountry of, on the edge of the Appalachians. There weren't a lot of ministers out there. So there weren't people to preach to them. And they really liked this Great Awakening movement. If for no other reason, it brought new people into the community to talk to. When you're out in the middle of nowhere, companies kind of, every once in a while, something you want. And there was kind of a sense of religious decline. So you'll have kind of two different groups. You're going to have itinerant preachers that are going to, this is when the revival movement starts. The preacher travels by horseback. And you're also going to have more traditional ministers that are going to go through the cities that are just challenging the local ministers. Jonathan Edwards is one of those. He started a revival movement in 1734-35. He was a congregational minister in Northampton, Massachusetts, but he felt that most Congregationalist ministers were cold, dead fish, and that they were leaving the hearts untouched. And his movement was to touch those hearts. And he did it through very, very vivid descriptions of heaven and hell. I think y'all are the last.
Okay.
And he was very successful. Think the big tents, lots of people.
Like the beginning of the Baptist revival.
That's going to be part of it. The Baptists are going to be part of this. But this encompasses all religions. Everybody is going to get in on this. And there's going to be a second Great Awakening that's really going to be the Baptists. But yeah, think what we would think of as a big Baptist revival. I'm trying to think of a good movie, and all I can think of is "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" That has a revival scene in it, where they would just camp out for weeks, and people would find God. William Tennant was one of the first actual traveling ministers. He set up a school in Neshaminy, Pennsylvania, wherever that is. He was an Irish-born Presbyterian minister, and he had a log college at this town in Pennsylvania, where he trained traveling ministers. So you're going to get a lot of Presbyterians in the backcountry, because that's where they went, which kind of fits with the Scotch Irish anyway. There was a lot of competition. Not only was there competition between those dead fish parish ministers that they were complaining about to begin with, but there's also competition among the different traveling ministers. But there's also cooperation. There'll be revivals that feature 2 or 3 different religions within the same revival. You could pick whichever one you want. George Whitefield was sort of a catalyst for this. He comes in a little bit late, but he starts a huge movement. He would preach, one of his sermons is Gales of Heavenly Wind. And he had another one, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in which he describes God holding a person like a person would hold a spider or some other loathsome insect over the fire, so therefore over the pits of hell, as you decide whether you're going to kill the spider or not. Do you take mercy on it or do you kill it? He would draw huge crowds, and he was so good. Even Benjamin Franklin, who was a avowed deist, emptied his pockets at the end of the speech. These people were orators. They could talk. And that's not a tradition in America anymore. I don't know if it's a tradition anywhere in the world anymore. But in the 16th, 17th, 18th, even 19th century, even into the early 20th century, oration was a skill. People would pay to come and listen to somebody talk. We'll pay to go watch a comedian, but I don't know that any of us are really gonna get too excited to go pay to maybe watch somebody recite Shakespeare, but they would. That was entertainment. And if you were a good speaker, and this is a little bit different because this is religion, but if you could hold a crowd, you could do almost anything. He was flamboyant, and he was very, very effective. He converted a lot of people. This movement also targets women. I listed a few. These are all women who ended up preaching in the movement. Because they reached out to women because women were the most active in the churches anyway. And they create a movement that's very hard to control. And they create a movement that is going to stress the individualist aspect of salvation. That you didn't necessarily, you needed a minister, but you didn't necessarily, it brought your salvation down to your relation with God, which weakens the church. Because if your salvation is between you and God, you don't really have to have a minister. You don't really have to have a church. So this movement is going to undermine many of the established churches. The Congregationalists, which are the non-separating Puritans, are going to take a big hit. They're going to take an even bigger hit the next time around. This split churches, this Presbyterian split into the new side and the old side. The Methodist Church is going to split, even though it's just started growing. It stressed or got rid of emotionalism for reason. So in that way, it was like the Enlightenment. And it kind of does away with uniformity. Not everybody has to be exactly the same. And that really hurts the Puritan church. Because, the Puritans were all about, monitoring each other in their faith and acting a certain way. It's also going to have the result of creating a series of colleges. Because now, all of a sudden, these different denominations see a need to actively train, professionally train their ministers. Because if you don't have a professionally trained minister, can't be as good as just, one who learned the trade. So Harvard comes out of this. Harvard started out as a Puritan school to train Puritan ministers. College of William and Mary is an Anglican college. Yale is another Puritan college. Princeton with the Presbyterians. Columbia University is Anglican. Brown University is Baptist. Rutgers is the Dutch Reformed Church. Dartmouth is the Congregationalist Church. The only church to be established in this time that didn't have a church background was the University of Pennsylvania. And that was secular. And that was Benjamin Franklin's school. That was the one he established as a place of reason to learn about the Enlightenment, or to at least to follow Enlightenment thinkings. It's all going to kind of fade off by 1750, except Virginia. Virginia just keeps going. They really get into it. But it's going to have the effect of it's going to weaken habits of deference. You get this more of an evangelistic movement than before. And it's also going to heighten the need for toleration of dissent, because now they're spreading and people are picking and choosing, and you have different denominations in places where you didn't have them before. So you need this toleration of dissent. It has a big effect. It has probably a bigger effect on society than the Enlightenment did. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement. This everybody gets in on. And it changes kind of the flavor. And like I said, it's the first movement that encompasses all of the colonies. Everybody goes through the Enlightenment, or through the Great Awakening. And you get a little bit of that sense that we're all together. Just a little bit. It's just starting. So this is a good time to change to back to these colonies, even though they're mostly self-regulating at this point, are still part of the British Empire. And the British Empire is a big place. At one time, it's a little bit later than this, the British Empire can claim to never have the sun set on it, because they'll have colonies in all parts of the world, and at some point, at any time of the day, the sun is up at some point in the British Empire. British administration was spotty and inconsistent. They were citizens. They had been promised citizenship since the beginning of this whole colonial experience, but yet they weren't. Nobody had direct representation in Parliament. Virginia didn't have a representative in Parliament. Massachusetts didn't have a representative in Parliament. So they can't claim to be total citizens. They're lacking some of the amenities of being an English citizen. They did have local government, and they pretty much governed themselves, but there were some restraints put on the local government. There was always this thought that somebody can step in. The Crown, Parliament,